Having been in the ministry for 55 years, it's been my privilege to watch the United Pentecostal Church make history. It's grown from small beginnings to a thriving, vibrant spiritual army with evangelistic outreaches all over the earth. Many children who were born during this time of growth are now mature ministers and are pastoring thriving churches. Other ministers whom I've revered and learned from are now gone on to their reward. I've seen several generations come on the scene, moving slowly across the panoramic stage of our Pentecostal heritage. Most of the stories about them are positive, and they have heavenly escort endings. However, among the successful, there are some casualties thrown along the way, and regretfully, these casualties serve as a grim reminder of the penalty of failure and a life gone awry. Looking back through the years, I remember the failures of some men who were important in my life. And I note one major flaw in the armor of them all. And this flaw became their Achilles heel. They were accountable to no one. If they'd made themselves accountable to the right person, it may have saved them. Alas, their demise became a tragic event in the lives of their friends. Plato said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Let's talk about accountability. This lesson is about accountability. And we ask the question, well, what is accountability? The Apostle Paul wrote to the Romans in Romans 14 and 12, said, "So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God." So eventually everyone will have to be accountable for what they have done on this earth. Webster's dictionary describes accountability as the quality of state or being accountable, especially a willingness to accept responsibility for one's actions. That's quite a statement. To be accountable is to render yourself answerable to qualified people in the key areas of your life. These qualified individuals should be of the same gender as the person who is making themselves accountable. They should mentor, counsel, correct with complete openness and honesty, men looking each other in the eye with openness and honesty and discussing their lives with each other. This is accountability. True accountability calls for a high standard of moral and ethical excellence. And these are things that we should seek in our life. We should always seek to improve. Whatever we do, we should try to do it better. That way we will not stalemate. When we ever reach the top of the mountain, there's nowhere to go but down. And so we keep striving and we keep climbing. To be accountable to someone means that you set in confidence, and that's someone you just openly and confidently discuss your life. And you're ready after discussing your life to accept guidance and direction from that person. That's a part of accountability. To be accountable is to appoint a spiritual director of your life. This requires a teachable spirit and a total honesty and complete trust. These things are essential in accountability. The process of accountability involves dedicated commitment and effective communication, constantly on a regular basis communicating. Accountability develops a growth process, which will in time cause others to be accountable to you, especially in the area of leadership. And in this area, you would reap what you sowed. Accountability is not a support therapy. It's not where you go with each other and you tell each other your troubles and you cry on each other's shoulders, but is men getting together for the purpose of probing thoughts and desires which might be detrimental to Christian development. And these are the things we want to do. We do want to develop our walk with God. Accountability doesn't allow for excuses. You see, people who make excuses never stop making them. People who make excuses get to where they expect you to believe them. And people who make excuses seldom change. But excuses are roadblocks to real performance. You want to do something for God, don't make an excuse. Make an attempt. Sometimes in that attempt, you won't succeed. But it's better to fail trying than not to try at all. Accountability is a binding relationship from which strength for righteous living is drawn, helping each other. It is designed to deal with the human struggles that are detrimental to holiness in your daily lifestyle. That's what accountability is. Accountability creates an environment that's conducive to spiritual personal disciplines and maturity. That's accountability. Accountability helps maintain a focus on vows of integrity, ideas and values that are pertinent to wholesome living. All of these things are enforced in accountability. And we have made those vows. We made a vow. If you're a man, you made a vow to the woman you married. If you're a woman, you made a vow to the man you married to love until death do us part. We made vows to God when we asked Him to forgive us of our sins. When He gave us a call into the ministry, we made another promise to do whatever He asked us to do. And accountability brings us into focus, not only to remember, but to keep those vows that we made to God. And then we ask the question, well, who should be accountable? Who is it? And the truth, of course, is everyone. People who aspire to reach their full potential. They want to be the best they possibly can be for God. They should religiously practice accountability. This decision has got to be voluntary. It can't be forced. It's got to be deliberate. It's got to be something that an individual wants. If you try to force it, it won't work. You have to desire it. A person has to say, I have something very precious from God. I want to guard that. I am a human being. I have all the natural feelings that any human being would have. And so I want to guard against the weaknesses in my life. And I share my life with someone else who may in turn decide they would share their weakness with me. In total confidence, told to no one, absolutely no one. And in that way receive counsel and guidance. Everybody needs to be accountable. All leaders need to be accountable. I have seen many leaders in my life that were not accountable to anybody, but they were on dangerous ground. But leaders need to be accountable. First of all, they're accountable to God, and that's all right. But we also need somebody on this earth that we're accountable to. Because when we do or say or act in some way that's not pleasing to God, God's not going to speak out of heaven with a voice and say, you did wrong. But when we share our faults and failures and weaknesses with other people, they can see those faults and failures and they can give us good advice. Leaders need to be accountable to the people they lead. A pastor, an associate pastor, an assistant pastor, secretaries, whoever it is, the people we lead and that are under us, we should be accountable to them. We also, as leaders, should be accountable to those who are over us in the chain of command. It's impossible for us to stabilize ourselves without having somebody in our life to help us. You see, power tends to corrupt. So leaders become a special target for Satan, particularly in the area of accountability. It's easy to get into a position of leadership where people respect you to the extent they won't ask you questions that people need to ask. And so Satan makes a strong attempt to seduce these leaders and make them think they don't need anybody. They don't need to be accountable to any other person on the earth. That is a very dangerous place to be. Everybody needs to be accountable to someone. The Apostle Paul said to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 10 and 12, "Let he that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." In other words, you think you're strong. You think that time has proved that you have made yourself strong, and your reputation says the same thing. But remember, when you think you're strong, he said you better take heed and look lest you fall. In the age of fallen heroes and dishonest leaders, it is of utmost importance that accountability be a virtue that we desire. We've seen the fall of the televangelists. We've seen hypocrisy in high places. Some of our great leaders in the land were not true to their calling and the things they pledged to do. And so it looks as though there are many people in top leadership who are not accountable. And perhaps they weren't. This may have been their Achilles heel and the one fault that destroyed them. But I urge everybody who's listening me today, be accountable. Be accountable. The military requires accountability. The top leaders, the 5-star general in the Army is accountable to the president. And if you'll remember in the Korean War, when Mr. Truman told General MacArthur, don't go north of the 38th parallel in Korea, but he did. And President Truman fired him. He was no longer the commander-in-chief. Now, the president is accountable to the Congress. They can pull his coattail if they want to. And Congress, in turn, as individuals, is responsible and accountable to their constituency. The people who voted them in can also vote somebody else in. So when you get in the chain of command and leadership, there is some accountability. Now, every person on the earth ought to be accountable for their decisions, their choices, and their behavior. Now, we've got a world system that says, oh no, they didn't mean to do that. They did that under duress and pressure, and they're not responsible. But the Bible makes us all responsible for what we do. You see, if it were actually the case that everybody took responsibility for their actions, we'd live in a much better world than we live in today. Things would drastically be changed for the good. Let me say this. If a person is too big to be accountable, they have gone too high up the ladder of authority. If they are too big to be accountable, they're really, in truth, too little to lead. No one should be exempt or should exempt themselves from accountability. Nobody should ever say, well, here I am and I have made it. I have striven to get to this place, and I have reached the top. Now I don't have to tell anybody what I'm doing. And that is not a good place to be. The Apostle Paul confronted Peter at Antioch concerning Peter's eating with the Gentiles, and then when certain Jews came down from Jerusalem, Peter withdrew from those Gentiles and didn't eat with them. And this upset the Apostle Paul. And so he made Peter accountable to him. The marvelous truth is that Peter accepted. You read in Galatians 2:11, Paul said, "But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face because he was to blame." And even Peter, who the man with the keys to the kingdom of heaven, allowed himself to be accountable to the Apostle Paul. This showed some greatness in a great leader. Accountability is not a natural trait. It's not something is inborn in you as a baby. It's not something you grow up desiring and wanting. It is not an obvious thing of greatness, and yet it is truly a part of greatness. But you see, accountability is a surrender of our sovereignty over our own life. Now, I know we surrender to God and we say, God, you can take my life and you can use it, but this accountability is to an individual who sees us on a regular basis and knows who we are, what kind of person we are, where our weaknesses are, and where they need to shore up those weaknesses with us and confide in us what we need to do. I'm going to tell you, this is part of greatness. There should not be a difference between a person's public life and their private convictions. You see, many people need assistance in accomplishing this particular virtue because their private life and their their private convictions and their public life are two different things. You see, to live differently than that is pure hypocrisy. And there will not be one hypocrite get into heaven. He's coming back for a people that are called, that are chosen, that are faithful, without spot, without wrinkle, without blemish, without any such thing. The Apostle Paul said, I fear lest after I have preached to others, I become a castaway. And I don't know about you, but I do not want to be that castaway. And so I'm willing to make my life accountable. A man once said to his pastor, no one tells me what to do. And he was telling the truth. Nobody did. And nobody ever did tell him what to do. He said, my boss on the job is the only person in this world that can tell me what to do, and I have to accept his wishes in order to get my paycheck. But you know what? I know that man today. The years have not dealt kindly with him. He left the church, took his family with him. His wife is backslidden, raising his children without God. They're lost. What a price to pay for independence. It's not just us. It's the people we affect, the people we lead, the people that we influence. It could be our family. It could be our neighbor. It could be somebody on the job. It could be somebody anywhere that your life is influenced. So it's important that when we walk with God and we make our statement of commitment, that we keep that commitment. And oftentimes we need somebody to help us in this area of accountability. We need to ask ourselves some honest questions about ourselves. When we select the person that we're going to make ourselves accountable to, we need to ask some questions. And let me just name a few of them. Who nurtured me through my spiritual infancy? Now we're trying to find somebody to help us be accountable. Who was it that brought us to the Lord and strengthened us in our weaknesses? Who responded favorably when I confided them about my call into the ministry, and who encouraged me? Who is it that has been supportive of my ministry, even in my infancy spiritually in the ministry of God? And through all my struggles, who was it that gave me the encouragement that I needed and wanted so many times? And then who also has taken out of their busy schedule personal time to give direction to my ministry and to keep me on course? Who was it that in love has corrected me and given personal direction and told me about my mistakes? Who is it that's done this? And who is it that has saved me from self-destructive pride, that has told me, yes, you did well, but don't you talk about it. Do like the Bible says, and let others praise thee. Success makes a person vulnerable to pride, and continued praise is pretty heady stuff. A minister can get to believing that. They keep telling him what a great preacher he is, what a great leader he is, all the great things that he does. And hey, you're in grave danger when you believe that. You say, that's how they look at me. But I know what I am. I know that I am only a lump of clay blessed by the presence and the power of God. What I am, God has made me. What I will ever be will be because of God. Everything that I have belongs to Him. My life belongs to Him. My future belongs to Him. I am just a steward of these good things, and I have handled them as a good steward. So don't believe it when people continually praise you. The wise man in Ecclesiastes 4 said, better a wise and a poor child than an old and foolish king who will no more be admonished. He's a king now. Nobody can tell him what to do. That's a bad place to be. You see, there are dangers in the island mentality. Successful people especially need to guard against the Lone Ranger syndrome, or we call it the island mentality. I'm everything all by myself. I know what I want to do. I know where I want to go. I know what I want to be. And I know who I want to help me. And don't anybody tell me what I want to do. And that's the island mentality. The book of Amos records a preaching of a prophet, and his name was Amos. He lived in the southern portion called Tekoa, and God sent him from Judah, Tekoa in Judah, up to Israel and through the city of Bethel. And he sent him there to preach, and preach he did. He preached against excessive drinking of wine. He preached against taking bribes. He preached against mistreating the poor. He talked about being at ease or affluent luxury, ease in Zion. He talked about desecrating the Sabbath and cheating in their business transactions. And this they were all doing. And Amos the prophet lifted up his voice and he decried these things. You say, well, they repented and they wanted to be good people. No, they did not want to be accountable to anybody. The king, the high priest, and the people all refused to be accountable to the words of God that God told this man to come up and preach in the city of Bethel. They said, Bethel is not able to bear your words. Go back where you came from and eat bread down there and prophesy down there, but don't preach anymore in our town. It was true words that came from God, but they did not want to hear them, and they did not want to be accountable. Consequently, destruction happened to Israel in 721 BC. The Sennacherib brought his Assyrian army, and they totally wiped out the nation of Israel, took their people, scattered them in various nations, and no one has ever been able to find those particular tribes of Israel again. You see, God's word is true. We don't have to believe it, but someday we will be accountable for it. A young preacher called his pastor to tell him of a special revelation that he'd had. He said, God gave me this revelation, and I have learned to help people who are being tempted. And I take them through this prayer of deliverance, and when I'm done, they're not tempted anymore. He said, somebody took me through this method, and he said, I had personal problems that I'm no longer problemed with. They don't bother me anymore. And he began to tell this pastor about all of the situations. And the pastor listened very carefully. And finally he said, what you sound like is good. What you're talking about seems to be good. But it's not scriptural and it's not biblical. I would suggest that you draw back from what you're doing and get back in the Bible. But the young man did respect his pastor, or he wouldn't have called him, but he was not accountable to him. He felt like that what he had and what he knew was more than what the pastor knew. And so he continued in his method of what he called deliverance. And as he continued, of course, the devil tripped him up, pride got in his heart, and his entire family was lost. He lost his ministry. He lost his soul. His wife backslid. What children he's got are not raised in the house of God because he would not be accountable. You see, the records of failure of ministers is pretty great. And I have watched some of these. I have seen ministers whose ministry was in demand everywhere. They pastored great churches. They preached great sermons, but they had a weakness, a single weakness. They were not accountable to anybody, and they refused to be accountable to anybody. They were almost as sovereign as God. You see, they modeled their leadership after the island syndrome. And sadly, oh sadly, the words of truth from the mouth of David became a reality in their life. When David said, how are the mighty fallen? It was true in their lives because they practiced the island syndrome. A young minister left his church to begin a home missions church across town. The man had been marvelously delivered from alcohol and from immorality as a new Christian. And now he felt his call to preach, and now a place had called him to preach, and he was going to raise up a church. He was very successful as a young pastor. In fact, his success was phenomenal. He worked at a secular job for a while, but the church grew under his ministry, and shortly the church was able to support he and his family. It was financially strong enough. And then the young man completely cut off his ties from his former pastor. He was doing a better job than his pastor, or so he thought, and he didn't need him, and he didn't need to be accountable. But before long in his ministry, the devil lifted him up with pride, and the old temptations came back to him. The temptations for alcohol and the temptations for immorality came back. And since he had not maintained any contact or accountability, pretty soon the weakness overcame him, and he went back to his alcohol, and he went back to his immorality. He lost everything. He lost his ministry. He lost his soul. He lost his family. He lost his church. And then he became an alcoholic. All because he would not be accountable. He was an island unto himself. But what if he had been accountable to his former pastor and say, Pastor, those old problems are coming back. Those old temptations have arisen in my life. And he would have confided in that pastor, would have prayed with him, would have advised him, would have called him on a regular basis, would have checked back to see how he's doing. He could have been pastoring a great church today instead of being lost forever. You see, among the people who are not accountable are the great casualties of life. The 16th chapter of Numbers records the demise of Korah. Korah was a Levite, but he was not content. He wanted to be a priest, and the priests came from the tribe of Levi, but they were over the Levites and over all the people. And Korah wanted to be that kind of leader. He resented the authority of Moses and Aaron, and he was under their leadership, and he was supposed to minister under them. But he resisted accountability to the authority. And finally, Korah gathered 250 princes from the assembly, and they all sympathized with him. And a great confrontation followed between Korah and Moses and Aaron. Korah said to Moses, "You take too much on you. All of God's people are leaders," he as much as said. The Apostle Jude calls this challenge the gainsaying or the speaking against of Korah. You see, this is Korah speaking against Moses. "Woe unto them," Jude said in the 11th verse, "for they have gone in the way of Cain and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward, and notice, and perished in the gainsaying of Korah." You see, when these opposing sides faced off, God caused the ground to open up and then close again on Korah and every one of his followers. God had instituted a government called theocracy, a God rule. And Moses was the selected leader under God of that government. He had been chosen of God. He was God's mouthpiece. If they wanted to hear from God, they heard it through Moses. God did not tolerate Korah's rebellion. The sad ending of this story involves quick judgment upon Korah and all those who followed him. The defiant Levites stood in the door of their tents with their wives, their sons, and their little children, and they all perished. In Numbers 16:32 and 33, it says this, "And the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, their houses, and all the men that appertained to Korah, and all their goods went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them." You see, they lost their invitation to the promised land. They were never going to be there. Some pastors have left the ranks of the tried and the faithful and have taken their families and their churches into what's called a charismatic world. These men have proclaimed that holiness and separation in living is legalism and bondage, and now they're free. In short, they really wanted to be free from any type of accountability. But notice, in almost every case that I've observed of the decision of these, the ending was failure and disappointment. It was not a good ending. Their churches lost membership. Their children became disillusioned and often backslid. Their wives sometimes backslid, and many of them left the ministry, and they themselves left God. We must not be an island. We need to be accountable. You see, in the book of Joshua is the story of Achan. Achan knew the command of God that the spoils of Jericho were to go in the treasure of the house of God. He also understood the ethical concept of obedience. He knew what he was supposed to do. But he had a weakness for prosperity and success, and he'd been in the wilderness all this time, and he couldn't wait to get his hands on some of the things that God had promised, and his weakness overcame him. He hid a Babylonian garment. He took 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold, and all these things belonged to God. You see, when this happened, Israel no longer won victories. They were defeated at Ai, and Joshua was on his face. He wants to know what the problem is. And God said, there's sin in the camp. So Joshua marches all the tribes before him, and here comes Achan. And he says to Achan, man, give praise to God. But the problem, he couldn't praise God. Sin was in his heart. His praise had left him. And then Joshua said, what have you done? And he said this, I have sinned. Achan was taken to the valley of Achor, accompanied by his sons. The Bible says his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, and his sheep. And they were stoned. Also with him was the tent, the silver that he'd taken, and the gold that he'd taken, and the garment that he'd taken. And all the living were stoned, and everything else was burned with fire, and then buried in the valley of Achor. The genealogies of Achan ceased that very moment because he would not be accountable. You see, accountability is a safety belt. What if Achan, when he realized this temptation, Jericho had fallen, spoils of war were everywhere, and people were picking them up. He simply picked some up too. But when he picked them up, he wanted to keep them for himself. And God said, this is the first fruits. This belongs in the treasure of the house of God. What if he had said, I think I'm going to take this garment home with me. I think I will hide this wedge of silver, the shekels of silver and this wedge of gold. And I think I'm going to keep them. What if he'd confided in a trusted friend who would have said to him, you know what God said. You know what Joshua has commanded. You know the penalty for disobedience. I'm your friend, but it's the wrong thing to do. Achan might still have generations today that are on the earth, but instead his genealogies were cut off. You see, it's important that we be accountable to someone. Many, many lives would have been spared had Achan obeyed the word of God. Proverbs 27:9 says this, ointment and perfume rejoice the heart. You like to smell something good. So does the sweetness of a man's friend by hearty counsel. Hearty counsel, correct counsel, good counsel will cause the heart to rejoice. In Proverbs, the same chapter, verse 17, it makes a similar statement. Solomon said, iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the counsel of his friends. How about that? He makes his friend think, and he causes him to think and to give right judgments. The wise counsel of a friend, if it is received, can bring about objective thinking, which will result in making wise decisions. And we need to make wise decisions. Men that are accountable to each other strengthen one another. They strengthen their shortcomings and their failures. They help them in their struggles, and they help them when they're being tempted if they're totally open with each other. You see, their openness and total honesty receives not condemnation. You don't condemn them, but godly counsel, advice to do the right thing. Accountability is a practice that saves lives. Two ministers made a vow to each other that before they ever did anything that would adversely affect their ministry, they would call the other. They made that vow. One man was asleep in bed, and the phone rang, and it was his friend that each was accountable to the other. And he told him what he was going to do. He's leaving on the next plane. He's going to another city. He's not coming back. He's leaving his family. He's leaving everything behind. That minister got out of bed. He quickly dressed. He jumped in the car. He sped across town. He arrived at the airport just minutes before his friend did. And when his friend walked in the door, he grabbed him and he set him down and he began to talk to him. He pled with him. He told him all of the things that would result of a bad decision. Told him of the price that he would pay, of the people that he would affect, of lives that would possibly be lost because of him. And before they were done, the man repented of his thoughts. He renewed his life with God. And he said, I'm going home to my family and take care of my family the rest of my life. Being accountable saved him and his family from a tragic separation. The young man grew discouraged in his Christian walk, and he got with some people that didn't encourage him but discourage him. And then he got kind of depressed, and he felt frustrated. He finally went to a psychologist. He opened his heart to the psychologist, and the psychologist told him this: what you need to do is go out in the countryside where nobody's around and scream your frustrations and curse. And the man walked in my office. He said, Pastor, I'm here because you're my best friend. And he said, I'm here to tell you goodbye. And he told me the story. I asked him, did you curse? He said, yes, I did. Did you scream? Yes, I did. I said, well, did you feel better? He said, no, I really didn't. But I'm leaving God and I'm leaving the church. And since you've been my best friend, this was an orphan boy. He said, I'm here to tell you goodbye. And I said to him, I was that pastor. I said, called his name, and I said, I am your friend, but I'm not your best friend. Your best friend is right down the hall in that prayer room. And if you're totally honest with me, you will go tell him goodbye before you leave the church. Will you do that? He nodded his head and said he would. And I sat in my office and waited because this needed to be done alone. And moments went by and quite a bit of time went by. And I heard sobs and groanings and prayer come from that prayer room. I sat there and waited probably for an hour. And finally the young man came back to my office. His cheeks were stained with tears. His eyes were red. And he said, Pastor, I could not tell him goodbye. Accountability saved him. Not only saved him, saved his family. He raised his children in the house of God, still lives for God. The young man that he raised and was his son had a call of God on his life. What the difference was made was because of accountability. Accountability. You see, the 70 evangelists that Jesus sent forth came back. And you know what they said? Oh, devils were subject to us. But Jesus, he kind of brought forth the priorities. He said, wait a minute. You can get pride over that. Don't rejoice that devils are subject to you, but rejoice that your name is recorded in the book of life. He is bringing them back to accountability. An outstanding evangelist who had preached all over the world, a man that I know and trust, has made himself accountable to two preachers. He said, I call these preachers on a regular basis, and if I could tell you, and I can't, there are specific things they have told him not to do, and he has followed those instructions explicitly. It is a safety belt for that evangelist because he is outstanding. He preaches in some of our largest churches. Timothy was accountable to the Apostle Paul, and this was evidenced by Paul instructing him. He called him Timothy, my dearly beloved son. Timothy, my own son in the faith. You see, Paul had no reservations about instructing Timothy because he knew that Timothy was accountable. It's possible for members of the opposite gender in the congregation to fall in love with the pastor. And the man of God must live with the knowledge of the vulnerability of some of his constituents. You see, it's of utmost importance that they act properly and protect themselves by always having a third party present when they are in the presence of the opposite sex. And also, it's always good to have their spouse. They should be accountable to their spouse at all times. In addition to whomsoever they have made themselves accountable, they should be accountable to their spouse. Life is made up of things that should cause people to be accountable. Accountability needs some action. A person needs to seek to be accountable in every area of their life. You see, they need to be accountable in their relationship to their pastor, if they are a layman. They need to be accountable to their family in that relationship. People need to be accountable in the handling of financing and finances. They need to be honest. People who work at a job need to be accountable to their employer for the amount and the quality of work they produce. Listen to this one. Hold your seat, fasten your safety belts. They need to be accountable to the use of the internet. I just had a young minister tell me that everything he looks at on the website goes into the computer of a friend, and likewise from the friend to him. Everything they view on their websites go immediately into the computer of the other. That is a safety belt. You see, viewing objectionable objects, we ought to be accountable in these things. And the building of a reputation in the community, the people that we live among should believe in us. And so we should be accountable for taking the opportunity of making decisions. And those decisions that affect our lives and others, we should be accountable for those. We should be accountable for developing proper attitudes and avoid little seedlings of pride and anger and bitterness that can destroy a life. You see, two leaders can make themselves accountable to each other by sharing complete confidence, becoming transparent and vulnerable one to the other. Some of the benefits of this kind of liaison include counsel, affirmation, and encouragement. Accountability involves warnings, corrections, rebukes, and must be received and followed as per the mutual agreement. That's part of it. This kind of practice produces integrity. Is that what you want? Character. That's what we need. And centered on the ethic of personal disciplines. Chuck Swindoll, in his book Rise and Shine, records 7 questions that people who want to make themselves accountable can ask each other. They are: have you been honest in your finances this week? Good question. Have you spent time in daily prayer and Bible reading this week? Have you spent, number 3, have you spent quality time with your family this week? Number 4, have you been involved in any appropriate situations with a member of the opposite sex? Good question. Number 5, have you exposed yourself to any explicit material this week? Number 6, have you lived up to the mandate of your calling this week? And number 7, have you just lied? Good questions. You can say yes or no, or you might elaborate. You're not restricted to yes or no. Good questions. Excellent questions. In summary, there's safety in bonding with a trusted friend that cares about you and your ministry and your family. This friend who accepts a responsibility for your spiritual well-being gives you oversight. He gives you wise counsel that will help you protect the most cherished possession that heaven can offer, and that's your ministry. When a preacher is helped to avoid moral and spiritual bankruptcy, a life is saved, a family is saved, and often a church is saved. Untold future generations are affected. So I ask you, is being accountable to somebody for your life and your ministry, is it too much to ask